Hey guys, tonight we're taking a trip into the serene world of Edo-era Japan, a time when floating tea houses dotted the waterways like little floating gems, offering a peaceful escape from the hustle of city life. Picture it, a beautifully crafted tea house drifting gently on the river, surrounded by blooming cherry blossoms while the soft hum of conversation mingles with the rustling of the trees. Can you smell the fresh tea in the air, the smooth wood beneath your feet, and the distant sound of water lapping against the wooden hull? The elegance, the grace, and the unique vibe of these floating spaces were more than just a luxury. They were symbols of status and refinement. But hey, you probably wouldn't survive in one of these. It wasn't all smooth sailing. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Oh, and feel free to drop your location and the time where you're watching this. It's always cool to know where my listeners are from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The floating tea houses were exactly what they sound like. Tea houses built on boats or small floating platforms, a unique luxury that came about in the early 17th century during the Edo period. They weren't just a way to enjoy tea, they became an emblem of luxury, status, and a life of leisure that only the wealthy could truly indulge in. Imagine drifting along the canals of Edo, now Tokyo, as you sip tea with friends or business partners, enjoying the view of the city and nature, all from the comfort of your little waterborne retreat. Pretty sweet, right? While we all know that the Edo period was known for its social hierarchies and rigid class structures, this floating tea house culture emerged as an interesting way for the rising merchant class to showcase their wealth. Of course, merchants were once seen as a lowly class, but with their sudden financial success came the chance to enjoy the finer things in life. And what could be fancier than having a tea ceremony on a floating platform? And it wasn't just about having a pretty view, it was about creating a unique, peaceful space where you could escape the usual grind of life, where nature and art fused in a beautiful, tranquil environment. Historians still argue whether these floating tea houses were meant solely for the elite, or if they were, in some way, a way to share the refined, peaceful experience of tea with those of lower social standings too. After all, tea ceremonies weren't just about drinking tea, they were about reflecting on nature, simplicity, and tranquility. Still, the floating tea houses remain an interesting symbol of Edo's unique blend of art, nature, and class. Now, let's take a quick detour to better understand the world these floating tea houses existed in. Picture yourself stepping into Edo, the capital of Japan during the early 1600s, when everything seemed to revolve around harmony, beauty, and refinement. The city was a kaleidoscope of layers, both physical and cultural. The feudal system was deeply embedded in society, with a strict class hierarchy and an intense sense of order. Samurai, merchants, artisans, and farmers all had their assigned places, and each one lived by their role. Edo was bustling, but it was a structured bustle, a city where people knew their place, but there was still room for the unique, the artistic, and the playful to blossom. The merchant class, once on the fringes, began to flourish as the samurai's power waned and trade prospered. These merchants grew so wealthy that they could afford luxuries that had once been reserved for the upper echelons of society. They had the means to not just live comfortably, but to enjoy some serious leisure. Enter the floating tea houses, the ultimate expression of their newfound wealth and desire for exclusivity. These tea houses weren't just places to sip tea, they were small floating palaces where they could indulge in cultural practices and show off their success to the elite, and sometimes to the public. But the floating tea houses didn't just pop up because merchants were feeling fancy. There was also a cultural shift happening in Edo during this period. The city was becoming a hub for artistic expression, everything from theatre to poetry, painting to tea ceremonies. And the way people engaged with nature was changing too. Nature wasn't just something to admire from a distance, it became part of daily life in an intimate, aesthetic way. Now, consider this. Tea was never just a beverage in Edo, Japan. It was a ceremony, an art form in itself, bound up with philosophy, tranquility, and meditative reflection. So these floating tea houses became not just physical spaces on the water, but also a place where people could retreat, both mentally and physically, into nature, into the calm, quiet rhythm of tea. Historians still argue whether these floating spaces were seen more as luxurious getaways for the elite, or as a democratizing force where everyone could appreciate beauty, nature, and refinement. What's clear is that they became symbols of status, allowing merchants, samurai, and even artists to immerse themselves in beauty, while also showing off their wealth in the most serene way imaginable. To understand why the floating tea houses of Edo were such a unique phenomenon, it's essential to dive into the economic transformation that helped bring them into existence. Floating tea houses weren't just leisurely spots where one could sip tea. They were symbols of the immense wealth and influence that the merchant class had accumulated in Edo, and they became a manifestation of the city's newfound affluence. But before we get to that, let's zoom in on how and why these extraordinary places became such a significant cultural and social fixture. The rise of the merchant class in Japan, particularly during the Edo period 1603–1868, was nothing short of revolutionary. In the early years of the Edo era, the power of the samurai class was firmly entrenched, with merchants regarded as a lower class, often restricted from owning land or exercising political influence. But as the centuries passed and the Tokugawa shogunate ensured a period of peace, the economic structure of Japan began to shift. The samurai, once the ruling class, found their military power increasingly irrelevant, while the merchant class began to thrive. Edo, the capital city, became a bustling hub of commerce, and the wealth of merchants ballooned. These merchants, often seen as the backbone of the economy, accumulated vast fortunes by engaging in trade, both domestic and international. With the growth of cities and the flourishing of trade, merchants found themselves with the financial means to do what once had been reserved for the aristocracy: indulge in luxuries, create art, and embrace leisure in extravagant ways. Enter the floating tea houses. The concept of a floating tea house was not merely about functionality, it was about ostentation. Imagine commissioning a floating platform or boat, elegantly designed with wooden walls, sliding doors, delicate paper screens, and intricate carvings, all meant to evoke the aesthetic principles of beauty, harmony, and serenity that were fundamental to Japanese culture at the time. These tea houses weren't small affairs. They were often spacious, designed to accommodate a handful of guests and their attendants. They were intended to be elegant, with every detail considered: wooden floors polished to a sheen, the faint scent of cedar filling the air, and beautiful flower arrangements that captured the season's essence. Tea was the focal point of the experience, but the space itself was just as important, offering a setting that blended nature and design in a manner that was designed to impress. But the floating tea houses were not just about looking pretty, they were about status. Owning a floating tea house, or even being invited to visit one, was a sign of success. Imagine this: you're a merchant who has spent years working hard, climbing through the social ranks, and now, as a symbol of your newfound wealth, you have your very own floating retreat on the water. Not just any tea house, but one that would make others jealous, with intricate designs that reflected your taste, your refinement, and your cultural sophistication. You were no longer just a merchant. You were someone who could afford the luxury of enjoying tea in a floating palace. These tea houses quickly became synonymous with prestige, and they were often used for more than just quiet tea ceremonies. They were places where merchants could entertain other influential people, engage in business discussions, and even show off their social standing to the samurai class. It was as much a social space as a private retreat, a delicate balance between intimacy and exhibition. Floating tea houses were an escape from the urban chaos of Edo, offering a serene space where nature, art, and commerce converged in a beautiful, almost ethereal manner. Historians still debate whether these floating tea houses were simply a way for the merchant class to demonstrate their wealth, or if they were part of a deeper cultural movement, where the act of indulging in tea and art was meant to elevate the soul and reflect the Zen Buddhist principles that were spreading through Japanese society. Zen ideals emphasized simplicity, tranquility, and mindfulness, and the floating tea houses embodied these values in their design. They were places for contemplation, but they were also places for enjoyment, for socializing, and for showcasing one's elevated status in the world of Edo's elite. The act of tea drinking itself was a highly ritualized practice in Edo, one deeply tied to the philosophy of wabi-sabi, a concept that prized beauty in imperfection, simplicity, and the natural world. A cup of tea was not just about refreshment, it was a moment to connect with nature, to engage in deep introspection, and to appreciate the fleeting beauty of the moment. In this sense, the floating tea houses were the perfect embodiment of this philosophy. They allowed guests to experience tea in the most tranquil, picturesque of settings, surrounded by the ever-changing landscape of water, sky, and seasonal beauty. Each floating tea house was like a small world of its own, suspended between the natural and the man-made, where the impermanence of life could be felt with every sip of tea and every glance at the water rippling beneath. But the floating tea houses weren't without controversy. While they were celebrated by the elite, they also sparked criticism from some quarters. For some, they were seen as decadent, extravagant symbols of excess in a society that, on the surface, valued modesty and humility. The lavish nature of these floating retreats could be seen as a reflection of the widening gap between the rich merchant class and the rest of society. For others, however, the floating tea houses represented the beauty of human creativity and the joy of living in harmony with nature. There was something undeniably magical about these boats drifting on the water, their delicate designs blending with the natural surroundings in a dance of aesthetics that was rare at the time. In any case, the floating tea houses became more than just luxury spots. They were a cultural phenomenon. They reflected the changing dynamics of Edo, where art, leisure, and business began to intertwine in ways that had not been seen before. They were an outward sign of a new social order, where wealth could create opportunities for personal expression and cultural participation. Historians continue to debate the significance of these floating spaces, but one thing is certain: they were a reflection of Edo's unique cultural landscape, where the rising merchant class used art and nature to create a world of beauty and indulgence that remains etched in the history of Japan. Whether they were about status, art, or a genuine appreciation for the tranquil nature of tea, the floating tea houses of Edo left an indelible mark on Japan's cultural heritage. Now that we've set the scene with the rise of the merchant class and their love for all things luxurious, let's talk about the waterways themselves. After all, the floating tea houses didn't just appear anywhere. They had a very specific context, one that made the rivers and canals of Edo the perfect backdrop for this unique leisure activity. Imagine the quiet hum of the city in the background, while you're afloat on the serene waters, drifting along like a leaf carried by the breeze. That sense of calm wasn't accidental. The waterways of Edo were not just functional channels for transportation, they were the lifeblood of the city, and they played a huge role in shaping how the floating tea houses fit into the cultural fabric of the time. The city of Edo was built on a series of rivers, canals, and bays, and much of the life in the city was centered around these waterways. In fact, Edo was often referred to as a water city. The rivers provided essential transportation routes for people and goods, while also serving as a place where people could escape the crowded, bustling streets of the city. For centuries, the waterways had been central to Japanese life, and their importance was reflected in the art, literature, and culture of the time. It was in this context that the floating tea houses found their place. The rivers and canals of Edo weren't just functional, they were scenic, beautiful, and deeply tied to the aesthetic values of the period. The concept of shakei, or borrowed scenery, was fundamental in Japanese garden design, and it extended to these floating tea houses. The idea was to incorporate the natural landscape into the view from the tea house, blurring the boundaries between the constructed space and the natural world. A floating tea house offered an intimate connection to the water and surrounding environment, with the river itself becoming a part of the visual experience. As you sat in the tea house, you would be surrounded by the constantly shifting beauty of the river. Sometimes the water would be calm, like a mirror, reflecting the sky and the surrounding trees. At other times, it would be rippling with the movement of boats, fish, and birds. The seasons also played a significant role in shaping the atmosphere of the floating tea houses. In spring, the cherry blossoms would bloom, their delicate petals drifting on the surface of the water like a soft pink blanket. In autumn, the maples would turn brilliant shades of red and orange, creating a dramatic contrast against the dark blue of the river. These seasonal changes gave the floating tea houses an ever-changing backdrop, making each visit unique and deeply connected to the passage of time. But the waterways of Edo were more than just a pretty view. They were also a social space. The rivers were full of boats, from small fishing vessels to large merchant ships. This made the waterways incredibly vibrant, teeming with life. For the elite, owning a floating tea house was a way to escape the noise and chaos of the city, but it was also a way to show off. Floating tea houses became places of spectacle, where people could be seen enjoying the refined pleasures of tea while surrounded by nature. The rivers themselves were part of the performance, as passing boats and barges often provided entertainment and glimpses into the lives of the other city dwellers. Historians still debate the extent to which these floating tea houses were meant for private enjoyment versus public display. Was the primary function to provide a peaceful, introspective escape, or was it a way for the elite to demonstrate their wealth and social status to the bustling crowds on the riverbanks? The idea of floating implies a sense of detachment, yet these spaces were always in close proximity to the lively activity of the waterway, with passers-by often stopping to take in the sight. Interestingly, Edo's rivers also served a more practical function. They allowed these floating tea houses to be mobile. The ability to move your tea house from one location to another meant that you could pick the most picturesque or exclusive settings at any given time. In this way, the tea houses weren't just a fixed part of the urban landscape. They were adaptable, always shifting to align with the best view or the most serene surroundings. This mobility added an element of exclusivity and variety to the experience, with each tea house journey offering a new setting and a new connection with the city's vibrant waterways. The concept of being surrounded by water and nature was a key aspect of the Zen-influenced ideals of the time. Zen Buddhism emphasizes the value of nature and finding peace and clarity of mind, and the floating tea houses were the perfect space to embody that philosophy. You could sit and sip your tea, surrounded by the flow of the river, watching the seasons change and contemplate the impermanence of all things. This fleeting beauty was central to the concept of wabi-sabi, which found beauty in the transient and the imperfect. The tea houses were a physical manifestation of this philosophy, where the act of tea drinking became an expression of the beauty of the moment. In sum, the waterways of Edo provided more than just a setting for the floating tea houses. They became an integral part of the experience. The dynamic nature of the river, with its constant flow and shifting views, was reflected in the fluid, ever-changing social and cultural atmosphere of the Edo period itself. Whether serving as a peaceful retreat from the city's bustle, or as a venue for displaying wealth and sophistication, the waterways were the perfect stage for these extraordinary floating spaces. Historians still argue whether the floating tea houses were purely a luxury, a symbol of the merchant class's newfound wealth, or whether they represented a deeper cultural yearning for serenity and connection with nature. What's clear, however, is that these tea houses were intimately tied to the flow of the water, making them a unique and significant part of Edo's social and cultural landscape. So, let's dive into the design elements that made these floating tea houses truly special. These weren't just any buildings on boats. They were meticulously crafted, often using the finest materials available at the time. These tea houses were a perfect marriage of art, architecture, and functionality, designed to harmonize with the natural surroundings while providing an experience of luxury and refinement. But what made them stand out? Why were they so captivating? Well, it all comes down to the details. First off, the layout and structure of the floating tea houses were carefully planned to maximize comfort and aesthetic appeal. A typical floating tea house was a small wooden structure that could be built directly on a boat or on a platform floating on the water. These weren't crude makeshift boats. They were high-end, custom-built vessels designed with every attention to detail. The walls were made from finely crafted wood, often cedar, which gave the structures a smooth, rich texture. The walls were sometimes adorned with simple but beautiful shoji screens, made from delicate paper and wooden frames, offering an unobstructed view of the water and surrounding nature. Inside, the layout was designed to be simple and functional yet elegant. Most floating tea houses had low platforms where guests could sit cross-legged, a traditional feature of Japanese tea ceremonies. The simplicity of these designs reflected the principles of Zen Buddhism, which emphasized humility, natural beauty, and the importance of simplicity in everyday life. There were often tatami mats on the floor, creating a soft, welcoming environment, and the furniture was low to the ground, promoting a sense of relaxation and connection with the earth. Every element was carefully considered, from the placement of the tea utensils to the design of the entrance. The tea house design wasn't just about comfort and simplicity. It was also about creating an atmosphere that allowed the tea ceremony to be performed with the utmost reverence and precision. In traditional tea ceremonies, the environment plays a crucial role in setting the mood and helping the participants achieve a state of mindfulness and tranquility. The floating tea houses were designed to enhance this atmosphere, using natural materials, simple decorations and soft lighting to create an environment conducive to contemplation. One of the key design features that made the floating tea houses so captivating was the use of windows and openings that allowed guests to enjoy the surrounding scenery. These tea houses were designed to blend seamlessly with the environment, providing views of the water, trees, and sky. The large windows and sliding doors could be opened to let in fresh air and the sounds of nature, further enhancing the connection between the tea house and its surroundings. Many floating tea houses also had small gardens or flower arrangements inside, which added another layer of beauty and tranquility to the space. Of course, one of the most striking features of these tea houses was their use of gold and lacquer. As a symbol of status and refinement, many floating tea houses were adorned with intricate gold leaf and delicate lacquer work. The wooden surfaces were often painted in deep, rich hues, with gold accents that shimmered in the sunlight, making the tea houses look almost like floating treasures on the water. These gilded embellishments were often seen on the supports of the roof, the sliding doors, and the railings. The combination of gold, wood, and nature created an almost otherworldly atmosphere, one that elevated the simple act of drinking tea into a ceremonial experience. Another fascinating aspect of the design was the floating platform itself. These platforms were designed to be sturdy and stable, yet they had to be lightweight enough to float on the water. To achieve this balance, the platform was often constructed using a combination of wood and bamboo, which were both strong and lightweight materials. The structure had to be carefully crafted to ensure that it would remain balanced and stable, even when the water was moving. Some of the most elaborate floating tea houses had multiple levels, with small bridges connecting different sections, creating a layered and dynamic experience for the guests. The floating tea house became not just a space for tea, but an entire sensory experience, where every aspect of the design, from the materials to the layout, was intended to heighten the feeling of peace, serenity, and luxury. These floating tea houses weren't just designed for the act of tea drinking, they were designed to be places of social interaction, where guests could enjoy the company of friends or business partners while immersed in a beautiful, tranquil setting. The design of the tea house encouraged conversation and connection, with large open spaces where guests could gather, relax, and enjoy the atmosphere. While the tea ceremony was the primary activity, these tea houses also served as venues for entertainment and leisurely pursuits. Sometimes musicians were invited to play traditional Japanese instruments, or guests would engage in poetry readings or other cultural activities, further enriching the experience. Of course, the design of these floating tea houses wasn't just about aesthetics, it was also about function. The spaces were designed to be practical and comfortable, allowing guests to relax and enjoy the tea ceremony with minimal distractions. The low wooden platforms and tatami mats helped to create a calming, grounded atmosphere, while the carefully placed windows and open spaces encouraged a sense of connection with the natural world outside. Historians still debate whether the ornate decoration of the floating tea houses was purely for status, or if it was an expression of the deep cultural reverence for tea and nature that characterized the Edo period. Some argue that the elaborate gold and lacquer work was a way to demonstrate wealth and sophistication, while others suggest that it was a way to elevate the tea ceremony itself, turning it into an art form that could be enjoyed in the most beautiful and serene setting possible. Whatever the motivation, it's clear that these tea houses were far more than just luxurious spaces. They were carefully crafted environments designed to enhance the spiritual, social, and aesthetic experience of tea drinking. Now that we've explored the floating tea houses' design and their cultural context, let's talk about one of the most integral elements that define their purpose: tea itself. Tea was far more than just a drink in Edo-era Japan. It was a cultural cornerstone, an art form, and a spiritual practice. The ritual of tea drinking was so woven into the fabric of society that it became a marker of one's social standing and personal refinement. And when it came to floating tea houses, the tea ceremony was the very heartbeat of the experience. At the core of the floating tea house experience was the shanoyu, or the Japanese tea ceremony. This was no simple cup of tea. It was a meticulously orchestrated ritual that demanded attention to detail, precision, and a deep sense of respect for the tea, the tools, and the surroundings. Each step of the ceremony was infused with meaning, and the setting, be it in a traditional tea house or a floating one, was just as important as the tea itself. In the case of the floating tea houses, the setting was perfect. It provided a tranquil, natural environment that allowed the guests to fully immerse themselves in the ritual. The tea used in these ceremonies was typically powdered green tea called matcha. It was whisked into a frothy, vibrant green drink and served to guests in small bowls. The process of preparing and serving matcha was an act of mindfulness, with each movement deliberately slow and precise. The tea ceremony wasn't just about the drink, it was about the experience, the conversation, and the deep connection with nature that it encouraged. What made the floating tea houses particularly special for these ceremonies was the environment in which they were held. Tea ceremonies are deeply connected to the Zen Buddhist principle of wabi-sabi, finding beauty in imperfection, simplicity, and the transient nature of a life. The floating tea houses were the perfect embodiment of this idea, as the natural setting constantly changed. The water flowed beneath you, the sky shifted, and the seasons provided a new landscape with each passing visit. The fleeting beauty of nature, the movement of the water, the blooming of flowers, the passing clouds, became an integral part of the ceremony. In fact, this ever-changing backdrop made each tea ceremony unique, as the same ritual would feel different depending on the time of year or the weather conditions. The physical setting of the floating tea house, with its smooth wood and tatami floors, also played an important role in the experience. The low tables and cushions encouraged guests to slow down and become fully immersed in the moment. The simplicity of the environment, with its carefully chosen decor and natural materials, helped strip away distractions and allowed the focus to remain on the tea itself. The entire space, from the design of the tea house to the surrounding nature, worked together to enhance the mindfulness and peacefulness of the tea ceremony. Tea, after all, was about more than just drinking something warm, it was about reflection and meditation. The act of sipping tea in a floating tea house, with the sounds of the water lapping gently against the side and the fragrance of nature in the air, became a moment of deep contemplation. It was a time for guests to leave behind their worries and distractions and embrace the present. Whether alone or with friends, the floating tea house provided an ideal environment to achieve this kind of mental clarity. But there's another layer to this story. While the tea ceremony in the floating tea houses was a sacred and meditative experience for many, it also became an opportunity for the wealthy merchants who frequented these spaces to engage in conversation, business, and even some light-hearted entertainment. Yes, the floating tea houses were sanctuaries of calm, but they were also social spaces where deals were struck, alliances were formed, and artistic and intellectual ideas were exchanged. Tea, in these spaces, was more than just a quiet drink. It was a medium for social interaction and cultural exchange. In fact, there were times when tea ceremonies were performed in a more extravagant manner, especially for special occasions. Guests might be entertained by traditional Japanese music or poetry, and the tea ceremony would become part of a broader cultural performance. This blending of art, tea, and social interaction reflected the luxurious lifestyles of the merchant class, who sought not only to enjoy tea but to celebrate it in the most extravagant way possible. Floating tea houses therefore became centres for both spiritual reflection and social networking, combining the best of both worlds. Historians still debate the true role of the tea ceremony in these floating tea houses. Was it purely an opportunity for personal reflection and meditation, or did it become more of a social spectacle for the elite, where the ceremony was used to show off wealth and cultural sophistication? Some suggest that, in the context of the floating tea houses, the tea ceremony was sometimes performed as a form of entertainment, with the host going to great lengths to impress their guests. Others argue that it remained a deeply personal and contemplative practice, no matter the setting. What we do know is that tea became a vehicle for both spiritual exploration and social display in these tea houses, and perhaps that's one of the most fascinating aspects of the floating tea houses of Edo, Japan. They allowed the blending of these two seemingly opposing forces: peaceful, contemplative solitude and vibrant, extravagant social gatherings into one seamless experience. The floating tea houses were never just about tea alone. They were about the setting, the company, and the experience as a whole. They were about combining beauty, nature, and culture in a way that made every moment feel fleeting, precious, and full of meaning. Whether they were a place for deep reflection or a place for extravagant social gatherings, these tea houses served as a reminder of the elegance and richness of Edo-era Japan's tea culture. Now let's look at another layer of intrigue: how floating tea houses became closely tied to the samurai culture. In the eyes of the public, samurai were the embodiment of discipline, honor, and martial skill. but they also shared an appreciation for art, culture, and nature. While their primary role was military, their involvement in tea culture, particularly in the floating tea houses, adds an unexpected yet fascinating depth to their character. These floating tea houses weren't just for merchants. The samurai too found them to be the perfect settings for contemplation, socialization, and leisure. Samurai was steeped in the Zen Buddhist philosophy, which prized discipline, simplicity, and mindfulness. This philosophy aligned perfectly with the rituals of the tea ceremony. The samurai were trained to be keenly aware of their surroundings, to maintain focus and calm under pressure, and to act with grace and respect. These qualities were directly reflected in the way they approached tea. The tea ceremony, with its meticulous attention to detail and focus on the present moment, mirrored the values that samurai held dear. In fact, many samurai were avid practitioners of the tea ceremony. They saw it as an opportunity to hone their mental discipline, much like they would with their swordsmanship. The act of preparing and drinking tea required the same level of focus and precision as wielding a katana. It became a meditative practice that allowed them to reflect on their inner thoughts and sharpen their concentration. Samurai would often spend hours in the quiet, serene environment of a floating tea house, drinking tea, contemplating life, and exchanging ideas with other elites. For them, the floating tea house became a sanctuary, a place where they could escape the pressures of warfare and politics and focus solely on the art of tea. But samurai didn't just drink tea for personal reflection. They also used it as a way to forge and strengthen bonds with others. The floating tea houses provided an intimate setting where samurai could meet with fellow warriors, politicians, and merchants in a relaxed yet refined environment. These were places where alliances could be formed, rivalries could be soothed, and discussions about strategy or philosophy could take place. Despite their strict code of honor, samurai could let their guard down in the floating tea houses, even if only for a short while. The shared experience of a tea ceremony allowed them to connect on a deeper level, transcending their social roles and military duties and fostering mutual respect. Some samurai even used the tea ceremony as a means of showing off their taste and sophistication. It wasn't uncommon for a samurai to invite friends, rivals, or potential allies to a floating tea house to display their wealth, taste, and knowledge of the tea ceremony. These events were often meticulously planned, with each detail chosen to create an unforgettable experience for the guests. The carefully arranged flowers, the hand-carved wooden utensils, the polished surfaces, everything in the floating tea house was part of the performance. A samurai's knowledge of tea could serve as a subtle demonstration of their refinement, making it clear that they were not just warriors, but cultured individuals with an appreciation for beauty and simplicity. This blending of military discipline and cultural refinement is what made the samurai's involvement in the floating tea houses so intriguing. On one hand, they were trained killers, disciplined and ruthless on the battlefield, but on the other hand, they were also deeply connected to the cultural traditions of their time, including tea, calligraphy, and poetry. The floating tea houses, with their combination of natural beauty, serenity, and cultural sophistication, provided the perfect setting for this dual nature to flourish. Historians still debate how deeply the samurai were integrated into the tea culture of the floating tea houses. Some argue that tea was primarily a pastime of the wealthy merchant class, and that the samurai were only occasional participants, using tea as a means to socialize and network. Others suggest that tea was as much a spiritual practice for the samurai as it was for anyone else, and that their involvement was an extension of their Zen Buddhist values. Either way, it's clear that the floating tea houses played an important role in the lives of samurai, offering them a place of peace, reflection, and social interaction. The floating tea houses weren't just a symbol of wealth and status for the merchants, they were also an important part of samurai culture. They represented a place where the strictness of military life could be put aside in favor of calm and contemplation, where the virtues of Zen Buddhism could be practiced in a social setting, and where samurai could connect with others in a shared appreciation for the beauty of nature and tea. The floating tea houses, then, were more than just elegant structures on the water. They were a place where samurai and other elites could come together to reflect, relax, and engage in the art of tea. This connection between the floating tea houses and samurai culture also helped to elevate the status of tea ceremonies in Japanese society. The practice of tea drinking became not just a leisurely pastime, but a reflection of the high ideals of the samurai, merging art, philosophy, and social interaction in a way that was unique to the Edo period. And the floating tea houses, with their combination of natural beauty, cultural significance, and social importance, played an integral role in this cultural fusion. Historians still argue whether the samurai's participation in tea ceremonies was more about the cultural enrichment of their lives or a way to further their social and political agendas. Perhaps it was a bit of both. The floating tea houses offered a space where the samurai could embrace their cultural heritage while still maintaining their roles as military leaders and warriors. Regardless of the true motivation, the connection between the samurai and the floating tea houses is a fascinating aspect of Edo-era Japan, one that speaks to the complexity and richness of the period. Now that we've seen how the floating tea houses connected to both the elite merchant class and the samurai, let's dive into another fascinating aspect: the symbolism of status they embodied. Floating tea houses, in many ways, were more than just places for tea. They were clear markers of who was who in Edo society. To visit one, let alone own one, was to publicly display your wealth, refinement, and taste. But beyond the obvious display of luxury, these tea houses were also a way for individuals to elevate themselves in the social hierarchy of the time. During the Edo period, social mobility was a rare phenomenon. The class structure was rigid, with people largely staying within the social tier they were born into. The samurai, for example, were at the top of the hierarchy, followed by farmers, artisans, and merchants. The merchant class, while wealthy, was often seen as lowborn due to their lack of military background. For the samurai, the mere act of making money through trade was seen as beneath their status. However, by the time the floating tea houses began to gain popularity, this dynamic had shifted. The merchants, now rich from years of booming trade, were beginning to enjoy privileges previously reserved for the samurai. The floating tea houses became a powerful tool for these merchants to showcase their newfound wealth and, in a way, to climb the social ladder. Owning or visiting a floating tea house was an exclusive affair, and by partaking in this luxury, merchants could demonstrate that they were no longer confined to the lower rungs of society. They could stand shoulder to shoulder with the samurai and other nobles, proving that they too had earned a place in the upper echelons of society. In essence, these floating tea houses allowed the merchant class to participate in the cultural and social spaces that had been dominated by the samurai, giving them a taste of elite status in a society where such things were normally off-limits. But the floating tea houses also played a role in solidifying the status of the samurai themselves. While many of the elite samurai had long held their place at the top of the social order, the rise of the merchant class brought about a shift in how status was perceived. The samurai began to participate more actively in the luxurious pursuits of the merchant class, including tea drinking. However, it wasn't just the merchants who used the floating tea houses to enhance their status. It was also the samurai who used these places to demonstrate their cultural sophistication. To engage in tea ceremonies, discuss art, and entertain in a floating tea house was a way to signal that a samurai wasn't just a warrior. They were a person of culture and refinement too. The ritual of tea drinking in these floating spaces allowed for a subtle display of status. A well-prepared tea ceremony, held in a well-appointed tea house, was a chance to show off not only one's wealth, but also one's knowledge of cultural practices. The precision of the ceremony, the beauty of the tea house design, and the refinement of the guests all contributed to an unspoken hierarchy of sophistication. The floating tea house became a stage where social standing was subtly, but powerfully reinforced. But let's not forget the aesthetic choices that played into this symbolism of status. The designs of the floating tea houses themselves were often stunningly beautiful and intricate. From the lacquered wood to the gilded details, these tea houses were not only functional spaces but were also considered works of art. The furniture was custom-made, often elaborately decorated with inlays of gold, mother-of-pearl or intricate carvings. Guests would sit on cushions arranged neatly on tatami mats, their tea bowls and utensils presented with the utmost care. The setting was serene yet dramatic, with every visual element carefully curated to make a statement. The exquisite craftsmanship on display in the tea houses became part of the performance. This careful attention to design wasn't just about luxury, it was about signalling cultural sophistication and an understanding of aesthetics. The floating tea house was an elegant, self-contained world where nature, architecture, and social interaction blended seamlessly, creating a space that spoke to the taste and refinement of those who could afford it. Even the setting, the flowing water, the changing seasons, the play of light and shadow contributed to the symbolism, The ability to exist in harmony with nature surrounded by such beauty was itself a sign of wealth and cultural privilege. The floating tea houses were also spaces where power dynamics could be subtly manipulated. For the merchant class, owning or hosting a gathering in a floating tea house was a way to gain favour with the samurai or other influential figures. These tea houses were often places of diplomacy, where deals were struck, alliances were formed, and reputations were built. To be invited to a floating tea house wasn't just an invitation to enjoy a cup of tea, it was an invitation into a world of political manoeuvring, social games, and cultural display. Historians still debate whether the floating tea houses were primarily a reflection of the merchant class's attempt to climb the social ladder, or if they were a genuine expression of cultural appreciation and respect for the finer aspects of life. Some scholars argue that these tea houses were simply a way for the wealthy merchants to assert themselves in a world that had previously been closed off to them. Others believe that the tea ceremony itself, with its deep spiritual and cultural significance, transcended class distinctions, offering a shared space for contemplation and social engagement for all participants. What's clear, however, is that the floating tea houses played a key role in transforming the social landscape of Edo Japan. They provided a venue for the upper echelons of society to display their wealth, refine their cultural practices, and assert their place in the cultural hierarchy. Whether used to consolidate power or simply to enjoy a peaceful retreat, the floating tea house became a symbol of the complex interplay between wealth, culture, and status in Edo society. As we move deeper into the fascinating world of floating tea houses, it's essential to explore the intricate rituals of the tea ceremonies that took place within them. These ceremonies were far more than just a social event or a chance to sip a cup of tea. They were solemn affairs filled with tradition, discipline, and symbolism. Every movement, every gesture, every detail was carefully considered, and the floating tea houses, with their serene setting and luxurious designs, provided the perfect stage for these sacred rituals. In the context of the floating tea houses, tea ceremonies were often a spiritual experience as much as a cultural one. The tea ceremony, or shanoyu, is deeply rooted in Zen Buddhist principles, emphasizing mindfulness, simplicity, and the transient beauty of nature. The tea ceremony is not just about drinking tea, it's about cultivating an atmosphere of respect, calm, and gratitude. In this context, the floating tea houses were ideal settings. The natural surroundings, with the gentle flow of the river and the ever-changing scenery, mirrored the core principles of Zen: impermanence, simplicity, and connection with nature. The ceremony itself follows a highly ritualized sequence of steps, each designed to foster a sense of calm and mindfulness. It begins with the preparation of the tea utensils, the cleaning and arranging of the tea bowls, the mixing of the matcha powder with hot water, and the careful whisking of the tea into a frothy, vibrant green brew. The host must pay attention to every movement, as the flow of the ceremony is intended to guide participants into a calm, focused state of mind. The host's actions are deliberate, each movement performed with precision and reverence, reflecting the importance of the present moment. Guests at the ceremony are expected to be equally mindful. The ritual requires them to bow in respect to the host, admire the utensils and the preparation, and drink the tea in a manner that reflects gratitude and humility. The tea is consumed in silence, the guests savouring the taste, the texture, and the warmth of the tea. It's a deeply personal experience, but one that also creates a connection between all those present, fostering mutual respect and understanding. In the context of the floating tea house, this shared moment becomes even more profound, as the tranquil setting heightens the sense of connection, not just between the guests, but between the guests and the natural world around them. Interestingly, the design of the floating tea house plays a significant role in the tea ceremony itself. The open spaces, the large windows offering views of the river and surrounding nature, the soft, muted lighting, these elements all contribute to the overall ambience of the ceremony. The tea house is not just a physical structure, it becomes an extension of the tea ceremony itself, a space that encourages reflection, mindfulness, and a connection to nature. The constant movement of the water beneath the tea house is a subtle reminder of the impermanence of life, reinforcing the Zen philosophy that guides the tea ceremony. While the traditional tea ceremony in a fixed tea house was a refined and meditative experience, the floating tea house added an extra layer of symbolism. Floating on the water, drifting along the river or canal, the tea house became a metaphor for the transient nature of life. Just as the water moves continuously, so too does time. The floating tea house, with its connection to the elements, serves as a reminder that all things are fleeting, an idea that was central to Zen philosophy. Guests participating in the tea ceremony within these floating spaces were reminded not only of the fleeting beauty of nature, but also of the ephemeral nature of their own lives. Historians still argue about the exact function of the floating tea houses in the broader context of the tea ceremony. Some believe that the floating tea houses, with their serene surroundings and luxurious designs, were simply an extension of the tea culture, a way to make the ceremony even more special and exclusive. Others argue that the floating tea houses represented a deeper philosophical connection to Zen Buddhism, with the floating nature of the tea house symbolizing the impermanence of all things. Either way, what is clear is that the floating tea houses were the ideal setting for a tea ceremony that was far more than just a drink. It was an experience that encouraged mindfulness, reflection, and a deeper connection to nature and to others. But the floating tea houses weren't only about spiritual or personal reflection. They also became spaces for socializing, intellectual exchange, and even artistic pursuits. Tea ceremonies in these floating spaces were often accompanied by discussions of art, literature, and philosophy. They provided a forum for the exchange of ideas, where guests could debate, discuss, and enjoy the company of like-minded individuals. In this sense, the floating tea houses became centers for cultural and intellectual engagement, bringing together people from different social classes to participate in a shared cultural experience. The rich cultural context of the floating tea houses, paired with the symbolic nature of the tea ceremony, made these spaces profoundly meaningful. They were not just places to relax and enjoy a drink, but places where people could engage with the deeper aspects of life, contemplate nature's beauty, and find solace in the fleeting moments of peace that the tea ceremony provided. Whether used for personal reflection, socializing, or intellectual exchange, the floating tea houses became an integral part of the cultural landscape of Edo Japan. Historians still debate the extent to which the tea ceremonies in the floating tea houses were about personal enlightenment versus social performance. Was the ceremony a deeply spiritual experience, or was it a social tool used by the elite to enhance their status? Perhaps it was a bit of both. The tea ceremony in the floating tea houses was a space where culture, nature, and social interaction intertwined, creating an experience that was as much about reflection as it was about connection. In this sense, the floating tea houses provided the perfect backdrop for one of Japan's most revered cultural traditions, one that continues to captivate the world today. As we continue our journey through the floating tea houses of Edo, it's time to reflect on their deeper significance in Japanese culture, particularly in terms of the connection between nature and architecture. These tea houses were far more than just stylish, waterborne versions of traditional tea rooms. They were artistic expressions designed to bring humans into harmony with the natural world. The floating tea houses were, in a sense, perfect representations of the Japanese ideals of balance, simplicity, and impermanence. They embodied the same Zen-influenced philosophy that permeated the tea ceremony, where every detail, from the smallest flower arrangement to the sound of the water beneath the floorboards, was part of a larger, harmonious whole. The concept of shake, or borrowed scenery, was central to the design of many traditional Japanese gardens and buildings, and it applied beautifully to these floating tea houses. Shake refers to the practice of incorporating the natural landscape surrounding a structure into the design of that structure. In a floating tea house, this principle was taken to the extreme. The tea house itself became an extension of the water, with the natural flow of the river or canal adding to the experience. The guests would sit in a carefully arranged interior, often with sliding doors that allowed for an unobstructed view of the surrounding landscape, allowing them to feel as though they were part of the scene. The scenery wasn't merely an aesthetic backdrop, it was integrated into the space, becoming a living, breathing element of the experience. Think about this. As the guests sipped their tea, they were not just reflecting on the beauty of the surroundings, they were experiencing the passage of time as it unfolded before them. The constant movement of the water, the changing sky, the rustling of trees, these were all reminders of the transient nature of life. The floating tea house, then, became a place to reflect not only on the fleeting beauty of the moment, but also on the impermanence of life itself. Just as the water moved beneath the tea house, so too did time move forward, carrying everything with it. The Zen influence was, of course, foundational to this idea. Zen Buddhism teaches that everything is interconnected, that nature and humanity are part of a greater whole. In the floating tea houses, this idea was reflected in the way the architecture blended with nature. The floating platforms themselves were an embodiment of this interconnectedness, man-made structures that floated effortlessly on the water, blending seamlessly into the environment. The design of these tea houses was not just about creating a space for tea. It was about creating a space where humans could connect with nature in a deeper, more meaningful way. In addition to the shaki principle, another important concept in the design of these tea houses was wabi-sabi, the appreciation of beauty in imperfection and transience. The floating tea houses, with their wooden walls, delicate paper screens and lacquered surfaces, reflected this aesthetic. Over time, the natural wear and tear of the water, the sun, and the elements would create a patina of age and character. The slight imperfections that developed over the years were seen not as flaws, but as part of the tea house's beauty. This was a reflection of wabi-sabi, finding grace in the imperfect, valuing the passage of time, and embracing the fleeting nature of life. This connection to nature also extended beyond the physical environment to the experience of the tea ceremony itself. In the floating tea house, guests weren't just enjoying tea, they were immersing themselves in a sensory experience that connected them to the natural world. The gentle sound of the water lapping against the sides of the tea house, the cool breeze, the smell of the river, and the visual beauty of the landscape all played a part in creating an atmosphere of tranquility and mindfulness. Every aspect of the experience, from the preparation of the tea to the delicate exchange of bowls between host and guest, was designed to encourage guests to slow down, appreciate the present moment, and connect with the natural world around them. The floating tea houses also had a very specific relationship with the seasons, and this connection to the changing cycles of nature further enhanced the sense of impermanence. In spring, the tea houses might be surrounded by the delicate beauty of cherry blossoms, while in autumn, guests could enjoy the vibrant hues of maple leaves. The seasons, with their constant ebb and flow, were an ever-present reminder that nothing lasts forever. The design of the floating tea houses, with their open spaces and flexible layouts, allowed the interior to change with the seasons, bringing nature inside and allowing guests to experience the beauty of each time of year. Historians still debate whether these floating tea houses were primarily a form of art, or whether they were simply a way for the wealthy to indulge in a luxurious pastime. Some suggest that the floating tea houses were nothing more than a status symbol for the elite, a way to showcase their wealth and refinement. Others argue that the floating tea houses were a genuine expression of Japanese aesthetics, a way to celebrate the beauty of nature and the passage of time through architecture and design. The truth is probably somewhere in between. While the floating tea houses certainly provided a luxurious experience for their owners and guests, they were also deeply intertwined with Japanese cultural values, from Zen Buddhism to the appreciation of nature. What is clear, however, is that these tea houses played a significant role in shaping the cultural landscape of Edo Japan. They became centers of socialization, intellectual exchange, and artistic expression, while also serving as spaces for contemplation and reflection. The tea houses themselves were designed to reflect the ideals of balance, harmony, and impermanence, and the natural world was always present, both inside and outside the tea house. In many ways, the floating tea houses represented the pinnacle of Edo's cultural and architectural achievements, a perfect blend of nature, art, and human ingenuity. Historians still argue whether the floating tea houses were purely a means for the elite to show off their wealth, or whether they were a genuine reflection of the deep cultural and philosophical currents that ran through Edo society. Perhaps, as with many cultural phenomena, it was both. What is indisputable, however, is that the floating tea houses left a lasting mark on Japanese culture, and their legacy continues to influence the design of tea spaces in Japan today. Let's take a moment to examine the role of the floating tea houses in the broader social and cultural fabric of Edo Japan. These unique spaces weren't just exclusive retreats for the elite, they became vital hubs for social interaction, blending leisurely relaxation with the business of networking, cultural exchange, and even political maneuvering. The floating tea houses offered a special environment that invited connection, not only with nature, but also with people from various walks of life, including samurai, artists, scholars, and merchants. They became important meeting places where both informal and formal discussions could take place, shaping the dynamics of Edo society in subtle but powerful ways. For the merchant class, the floating tea house was an arena for socialization and entertainment, but it was also a place for business transactions to unfold. Wealthy merchants would invite others, fellow traders, samurai, and even those in positions of power, to their floating retreats, where tea could be served alongside negotiations, intellectual discourse, or even the occasional performance of art. These settings created a kind of cultural currency. The sophistication of the venue and the thoughtful performance of the tea ceremony communicated a sense of cultural depth and refinement that could elevate the standing of both the host and the guests. A successful tea gathering could lead to new alliances, lucrative business deals, or even shift the dynamics of the social hierarchy. However, it wasn't just about business. These floating spaces also became integral to the cultural life of Edo. Artists and poets, many of whom were well connected with the merchant and samurai classes, would often gather in these tea houses to discuss their latest works, share ideas, or simply engage in conversation about the nature of art, beauty, and society. These gatherings could lead to collaborations, commissions, and the exchange of cultural and intellectual ideas. It's no wonder that many of the prominent artists, writers, and philosophers of the time frequented the floating tea houses. They were, after all, among the most refined spaces in which to nurture creative thought. Artists, in particular, found the floating tea houses to be an ideal setting for both inspiration and reflection. The tranquil beauty of the surroundings, combined with the refined and peaceful atmosphere of the tea house, made them perfect venues for painting, poetry, and other forms of artistic expression. It's said that some of the most famous ukiyo-e artists, those who depicted scenes of everyday life in Edo, from kabuki performances to the beauty of nature, would often use the floating tea houses as their subject matter. In this sense, the tea houses became living canvases, sources of inspiration for both art and poetry, and places where artists could directly engage with the culture that their works were portraying. For the samurai, the floating tea houses served as a venue for more than just leisure. They were a space for reflection and strategy. The samurai, who spent most of their time in military or administrative roles, could use the quietude of the floating tea house to engage in personal reflection or strategize with their peers. Tea, with its slow, deliberate preparation and consumption, offered a perfect counterpoint to the often hectic and intense life of a samurai. The tea house was a rare environment where they could disengage from the stresses of military life and focus instead on the aesthetics of tea and the art of conversation. For many samurai, the floating tea house served as a retreat, a place to reconnect with Zen Buddhist principles and refresh themselves mentally and spiritually. While the floating tea houses were traditionally seen as spaces for the wealthy merchant and samurai classes, their significance also permeated the lives of Edo's artisans, poets, and even performers. The floating tea houses blurred the lines between leisure, business, and culture, creating a multifunctional space where people from different backgrounds could gather and engage with each other. This democratization of cultural space played a critical role in Edo Japan's cultural renaissance, which was defined by an openness to artistic innovation and intellectual exchange. The floating tea houses, with their mixture of refined culture and accessible luxury, represented the height of this cultural flourishing. At the same time, these tea houses were incredibly exclusive. Not everyone could simply stroll into a floating tea house and partake in the tea ceremony. To be invited was an honor, a mark of status. Invitations were often reserved for the well-connected, for those with whom one could do business, or for those who could offer cultural or intellectual value. The exclusivity of the floating tea houses thus further enhanced their status as symbols of the elite, where only the most refined and influential were welcome. Historians still debate whether the floating tea houses were fundamentally about cultural enrichment, status display, or both. Some argue that they were simply another form of social capital, a way for the rich and powerful to flaunt their wealth and gain favour with others. Others believe they served as genuine cultural hubs, offering a space for the exchange of ideas, the cultivation of artistry, and the refinement of tea culture. In truth, the floating tea houses were probably a little bit of both, places where social hierarchy was both asserted and relaxed, where beauty and artistry could flourish in an atmosphere of intellectual and social freedom. As we continue to explore the legacy of these floating tea houses, it's clear that they were more than just luxurious spaces on the water. They were dynamic, multifaceted social and cultural centres where art, tea, and social politics intertwined. They were spaces where human connections were made, alliances were forged, and cultural and intellectual exchange took place. and while the floating tea houses of Edo Japan may have disappeared, their influence continues to be felt in Japan's modern tea culture and architectural design, where the balance between nature, architecture, and social engagement remains as important as ever. As the floating tea houses became increasingly integrated into the social fabric of Edo, their significance evolved, and so did their role in seasonal festivals. In Japan, the changing of the seasons has always been a deeply cultural and spiritual event, and the floating tea houses, with their intimate connection to nature, became an important setting for celebrating these transitions. Edo's elaborate seasonal festivals often brought a heightened sense of community, and the floating tea houses became central hubs of this seasonal rhythm. Imagine the floating tea house decorated with flowers, filled with the scent of fresh tea and surrounded by friends, as the seasons slowly shifted from one to another, a perfect scene of serenity and celebration. The most popular seasons for floating tea house gatherings were spring and autumn, times when nature was in full bloom or display, and the waters around Edo's rivers were calm and inviting. In spring, the cherry blossoms, or sakura, would burst into bloom, casting a delicate pink hue across the riverbanks. This was one of the most romantic times for floating tea house gatherings, where friends and lovers would gather to celebrate the fleeting beauty of the blossoms, sip tea, and share poetry. The fleeting nature of the sakura blossoms mirrored the transient nature of life, a concept central to Zen Buddhism, and provided a poignant backdrop to the meditative rituals of the tea ceremony. In autumn, the changing colours of the maple trees, koyo, turned the landscape into a riot of reds, oranges, and yellows. The crisp air and vibrant foliage created an entirely different mood, one of contemplation and renewal. These autumn gatherings in floating tea houses were perfect opportunities for reflection and appreciation of nature's cycles. The contrast between the warm tea and the cool, crisp air added to the sensory experience, and the tea houses became more than just places for tea. They became sanctuaries for celebrating the seasons, deepening connections with others, and appreciating the impermanence of life. The connection between the floating tea houses and these seasonal festivals was not only spiritual but also social. These gatherings were perfect for showcasing the host's wealth, taste, and cultural sophistication. Imagine a gathering where the air is filled with the sweet smell of autumn leaves, the aroma of freshly prepared matcha tea, and the sounds of delicate koto music. For the host, creating the perfect seasonal atmosphere was not just a matter of aesthetics. It was a way to signal their place in society, their refinement, and their understanding of both nature and culture. Through careful planning and a deep appreciation of the season, the host could elevate the experience of the tea ceremony and show guests how deeply connected they were to the natural world and the ever-changing beauty of the seasons. But the floating tea houses didn't just celebrate nature, they celebrated the broader cultural and artistic achievements of Edo. These gatherings often included poetry readings, calligraphy, and performances of traditional Japanese music, further enhancing the cultural significance of the floating tea houses. In this way, the tea house was a space not only for tea, but for the exchange of ideas, the performance of art, and the appreciation of Japanese culture in all its forms. Whether it was a quiet afternoon sipping tea under the cherry blossoms, or an evening of poetry and song in the cool autumn air, the floating tea houses were integral to the celebration of life's fleeting moments and the art of living well. The festivals held at these tea houses also represented an important intersection of cultural and social life. The samurai, despite their military role, participated in the festivals alongside merchants, artisans, and scholars. This melding of different social classes within the serene and refined setting of the floating tea house was remarkable. The tea house became a democratic space, where everyone, regardless of class, could come together to appreciate the arts, nature, and the shared experience of the tea ceremony. While the rigid social hierarchy of Edo Japan could make it difficult for people to interact freely, the floating tea houses broke down some of those barriers, providing a rare space for people from different walks of life to come together in celebration. Historians still debate whether the floating tea houses, and particularly the seasonal festivals they hosted, were primarily a way for the elite to celebrate their wealth, or whether they were a more democratic space where people of different social classes could interact. Some argue that these seasonal gatherings were largely symbolic, a way for the wealthy to display their refinement and power through their taste in art, culture, and nature. Others suggest that these events had a deeper, more egalitarian purpose, offering an opportunity for different classes to come together and share in the appreciation of beauty and culture. Regardless of the exact motivations behind these seasonal gatherings, what is clear is that the floating tea houses played an integral role in shaping the cultural landscape of Edo Japan. They provided a space for the celebration of the seasons, where nature and culture intersected in the most exquisite of ways. The seasonal festivals held within the tea houses not only celebrated the beauty of the natural world, but also fostered social connections and cultural exchange between different classes. They were a perfect example of how art, nature, and society could come together in a space that was both beautiful and meaningful. As Edo society evolved, so did the role of the floating tea houses. What started as a luxury for the wealthy soon became an essential part of the cultural and social life of the period. These tea houses, with their serene settings and cultural significance, offered a space where people could reflect, connect, and celebrate the beauty of life, nature, and human connection. The festivals that took place within them became a vital part of Edo's cultural identity, where the changing seasons were not just a natural phenomenon, but a time for celebration, contemplation, and connection. As we delve deeper into the history of floating tea houses in Edo, Japan, it's time to consider their eventual decline. Like many cultural practices, the floating tea houses, once a symbol of wealth, refinement, and cultural engagement, began to fade into the background with the passing of time. Several factors contributed to the decline of these luxurious retreats, from political changes to environmental shifts, all of which slowly dismantled the unique cultural significance they once held. Still, even as their popularity waned, the legacy of the floating tea houses lived on, leaving a lasting imprint on Japan's cultural landscape. One of the main reasons for the decline of floating tea houses was the changing political landscape of Edo, Japan. In the mid-19th century, Japan underwent a series of major transformations that shook the foundations of its feudal system. The rise of the Tokugawa shogunate was succeeded by the Meiji Restoration, which marked the beginning of Japan's modernization and the collapse of the old social order. The samurai class, who had been the backbone of the floating tea house's clientele, lost much of their power and influence. As Japan shifted from a feudal society to a more centralized modern state, the aristocratic and military elites who had once frequented the floating tea houses found themselves increasingly sidelined by a growing merchant class and the industrialization of the country. This shift in the power structure meant that the floating tea houses, which had been symbols of the elite's wealth and sophistication, gradually lost their relevance. The rise of new forms of entertainment and leisure, along with the changing social dynamics, meant that the floating tea houses became less important as social hubs. As the country modernized and industrialized, people began to favor other forms of leisure, ones that were more connected to the new industrialized world rather than the traditional nature-based experiences that the floating tea houses had offered. Additionally, environmental factors played a significant role in the decline of the floating tea houses. As Edo, now Tokyo, grew, so did its infrastructure, and the waterways that once provided the perfect setting for these floating retreats began to become polluted and congested. The once pristine canals and rivers were now filled with boats carrying goods, people, and waste, making it more difficult for the floating tea houses to maintain their tranquil, serene atmosphere. The pollution and overcrowding of the waterways compromised the very essence of what made these tea houses special, being able to float on clear, calm waters surrounded by the beauty of nature. As the natural beauty of the waterways diminished, so too did the appeal of the floating tea houses. Moreover, the development of alternative forms of entertainment and social spaces also contributed to their decline. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Western-style cafes, theatres, and other venues began to emerge in Japan, offering more modern and accessible forms of entertainment. These new venues, with their comforts and conveniences, gradually replaced the floating tea houses as the go-to spots for leisure and socialization. The appeal of sitting in a traditional wooden tea house on the water began to lose its luster, as people sought more contemporary options that catered to the demands of an industrialized society. Despite the decline in popularity, the floating tea houses never completely disappeared from Japanese culture. Though fewer were built, the legacy of these unique spaces lived on through art, literature, and the continued practice of tea ceremonies. The idea of the floating tea house, with its connection to nature, tranquility, and cultural refinement, continues to inspire many of Japan's modern tea spaces, and the symbolism of the floating tea house remains embedded in Japan's collective cultural consciousness. The floating tea houses also left an indelible mark on Japanese architecture. The design principles that guided their construction, blending nature with architecture, creating spaces that encourage reflection, and focusing on simplicity and beauty, are still influential in contemporary Japanese design. Modern tea rooms, gardens, and even homes still draw inspiration from the floating tea house, embodying its core ideals of harmony between human-made structures and the natural world. Interestingly, the memory of these tea houses has also been kept alive through artistic representation. Many ukiyo-e prints, famous works of Japanese woodblock art from the Edo period, depict scenes of floating tea houses, often as idyllic, serene places where people gather to enjoy nature, tea, and each other's company. These prints, along with other works of art from the period, helped immortalize the floating tea houses, allowing their memory to live on long after their decline. It's also worth noting that the concept of the floating tea house never fully disappeared. Rather, it transformed. Today, floating cafes, restaurants, and even hotels can still be found in Japan, offering a modern take on the floating tea house tradition. Though these modern iterations no longer carry the same cultural weight as their Edo-era predecessors, they are still a testament to the enduring appeal of combining nature, architecture, and leisure in a floating environment. In this sense, the legacy of the floating tea houses continues to inspire new generations, maintaining their place in the cultural imagination as a symbol of refinement, tranquility, and the beauty of impermanence. Historians still argue whether the decline of the floating tea houses was inevitable due to the changing political and social landscape, or whether they could have survived in some form if the environmental and industrial challenges had been addressed. Some scholars believe that the floating tea house's decline was a natural consequence of Japan's transition from a feudal society to a modern state. Others suggest that, had the tea houses adapted to the new conditions, perhaps by moving to cleaner waterways or incorporating modern elements, they could have continued to thrive. Regardless of the reasons for their decline, what is certain is that the floating tea houses of Edo Japan remain an enduring symbol of a specific moment in history, a moment when art, nature, and leisure came together in a uniquely elegant way. Though the floating tea houses of Edo Japan may have declined with the passage of time, their legacy has continued to shape the cultural landscape, even into the modern era. Today, the memories of these luxurious nature-bound spaces linger not only in Japan's architectural traditions, but in its spiritual and cultural practices. The idea of creating an environment where one could connect with nature, participate in the tea ceremony, and reflect on the fleeting nature of existence has not disappeared. Instead, it has evolved, inspiring contemporary tea rooms, gardens, and even public spaces. These modern spaces, though not floating, continue to carry the principles of serenity, harmony with nature, and cultural refinement that were central to the floating tea house tradition. One of the most enduring elements of the floating tea house tradition is the practice of the Japanese tea ceremony itself. While the physical floating tea houses may no longer exist in the way they once did, the art of the tea ceremony continues to be a vibrant part of Japanese culture, and it draws from the same principles that made the floating tea houses so meaningful. Modern tea ceremonies, whether held in traditional tea houses or contemporary settings, still reflect the core values of mindfulness, simplicity, and appreciation for nature. The floating tea houses of Edo may have provided the perfect setting for this practice, but the essence of the ceremony, its quiet elegance, its connection to the natural world, and its emphasis on the moment, is still alive in Japan's cultural heart. In addition to the continued importance of tea culture, the influence of the floating tea houses can also be seen in modern Japanese garden design. The concept of blending nature with architecture, of creating spaces where the boundaries between the built environment and the natural world are blurred, continues to guide the design of Japanese gardens and outdoor spaces today. Modern architects and landscape designers often draw inspiration from the floating tea houses, creating environments that are calm, contemplative, and in harmony with nature. These spaces encourage people to slow down, reflect, and connect with the beauty of the natural world, much like the floating tea houses did centuries ago. Moreover, the idea of floating spaces has not disappeared entirely. Japan still has a rich tradition of using water as both a design element and a functional space for leisure. While the floating tea houses of the Edo period were built on small boats or platforms, contemporary floating cafes and hotels now provide a modern take on this idea. These floating spaces may not carry the same cultural weight as their Edo predecessors, but they are an acknowledgement of the enduring appeal of floating environments where people can relax, reflect, and appreciate the natural world. These modern floating venues, whether on lakes, rivers, or coastal areas, offer a peaceful retreat, echoing the essence of the Edo floating tea houses while adapting to modern tastes and needs. The legacy of the floating tea houses also lives on in the arts. Many contemporary artists, especially those working in traditional Japanese media, continue to draw on the imagery of floating tea houses in their work. These artists may not be replicating the tea houses themselves, but they often evoke the peaceful, reflective atmosphere they created. Whether through painting, printmaking, or other forms of visual art, the floating tea house remains a potent symbol of tranquility, cultural sophistication, and a deep connection to nature. Even in a world that has become increasingly modern and industrialized, the image of a floating tea house remains a powerful reminder of a time when people sought a more intimate connection with the natural world through art, culture, and leisure. In the realm of literature and popular culture, the floating tea houses have also captured the imagination of modern audiences. They are often romanticized and idealized as places of beauty, serenity, and escape. Writers and storytellers continue to use the image of the floating tea house to evoke a sense of nostalgia for a simpler, more contemplative time. In literature, floating tea houses are often depicted as settings for moments of introspection, connection, and cultural exploration. These depictions keep the memory of the floating tea houses alive, allowing modern readers to imagine the beauty of these spaces and to appreciate their cultural significance. Historians continue to explore the complexities of the floating tea house phenomenon. Some see them as a product of the social and political changes in Edo Japan, a reflection of the rising power of the merchant class and the ways in which they sought to align themselves with the cultural and artistic ideals of the samurai. Others argue that the floating tea houses were simply a luxury of their time, symbols of excess and wealth. Still, others suggest that the floating tea houses were part of a larger cultural shift, where the appreciation of nature, art, and mindfulness began to permeate all levels of society, and the tea ceremony became a vehicle for both spiritual reflection and social interaction. What is clear is that the floating tea houses represented something unique in Japanese history, an idealized space where culture, nature, and society converged in a delicate balance. These tea houses were more than just places to drink tea. They were spaces where people could pause, reflect, and connect with the world around them. In their design, function, and cultural significance, the floating tea houses embodied the values of Edo Japan, values that continue to resonate today. Though the floating tea houses themselves may no longer exist, their legacy lives on through the continued practice of the tea ceremony, the design of modern tea spaces, and the ongoing influence of Japanese aesthetics in art, architecture, and culture. The spirit of the floating tea house, with its serene beauty, its connection to nature, and its celebration of the impermanence of life, remains an enduring symbol of the ideals of Edo Japan. And while the tea houses may be gone, their influence endures, quietly but profoundly in the heart of Japan's cultural identity. As we move toward the end of our journey through the floating tea houses of Edo Japan, let's reflect on their lasting legacy. The floating tea houses were much more than just places for leisure or displays of wealth. They were symbolic of a cultural moment in Japan, when art, nature, and social interaction merged into one deeply meaningful experience. Their decline was inevitable, shaped by political, environmental, and social changes. But the ideals they represented have continued to influence Japanese culture to this day. In particular, the floating tea houses are a direct reflection of Japan's long-standing relationship with nature. From the meticulous design of the tea houses themselves to the tea ceremonies that took place within them, the importance of the natural world was central to the experience. The floating tea houses allowed for a heightened sense of connection to nature, as the changing landscape outside the tea house window, whether it was the soft fall of cherry blossoms in spring or the brilliant red of autumn leaves, was as much a part of the experience as the tea itself. These tea houses provided a space where people could experience nature in an intimate way, connecting with the elements through tea, architecture, and quiet reflection. This deep appreciation for nature, embodied by the floating tea houses, has continued to shape Japanese culture in profound ways. Even today, Japanese gardens and tea houses are often designed to create a seamless relationship between the natural world and the built environment. The design principles that guided the construction of the floating tea houses, such as the idea of borrowing scenery, shake, and the celebration of imperfection, wabi-sabi, remain deeply embedded in Japan's aesthetic traditions. These principles have also influenced modern architecture and urban design in Japan, where the integration of nature into everyday life is a key goal. Another lasting impact of the floating tea houses is the continued importance of the tea ceremony in Japan. While the floating tea houses themselves are no longer the cultural centres they once were, the tea ceremony is as vibrant as ever, continuing to be a central cultural practice for many in Japan. The rituals and mindfulness of the tea ceremony, which was so well suited to the peaceful, natural setting of the floating tea house, remain a way for modern-day practitioners to reconnect with both themselves and the world around them. The legacy of the floating tea houses lives on in every carefully measured whisk of matcha, every moment of quiet contemplation during the ceremony, and every guest who shares in the experience. As we look back on the floating tea houses, we must also acknowledge their role in connecting people across different social classes. While they were originally spaces of exclusivity, reserved for the wealthy merchant class and the samurai, the floating tea houses were also places of cultural exchange, where ideas, art, and even political strategies were shared. In this sense, the floating tea houses were spaces where boundaries could be blurred. Despite the rigid class structure of Edo Japan, these tea houses allowed for moments of connection between individuals who might not otherwise have interacted. The practice of tea, in particular, encouraged mutual respect and understanding, and the floating tea houses provided a space where this respect could be cultivated. In a way, the floating tea houses acted as microcosms of Edo society, encapsulating the social, political, and cultural complexities of the time. While the merchants were certainly focused on status and wealth, they also played a role in the cultural development of Edo, and their floating tea houses were integral to that process. The samurai, meanwhile, used these spaces not just for business, but as a place of spiritual reflection, artistic engagement, and social interaction. The way these different classes interacted in such a refined and tranquil setting reflected the dynamic, often contradictory nature of Edo society. As the floating tea houses faded into history, their legacy was preserved in the continued practice of tea, the art of garden design, and the broader appreciation for nature and impermanence. Today, while floating tea houses may not be a common sight along the rivers of Japan, the spirit of these cultural hubs continues to live on in modern tea houses, public gardens, and artistic traditions. The essential elements of the floating tea house, nature, mindfulness, simplicity, and cultural exchange, are still valued in Japan and continue to inspire not only the Japanese but also those from around the world who seek to connect with these timeless ideals. The story of the floating tea houses is ultimately a story about balance. The balance between nature and architecture, between wealth and culture, and between the fleeting beauty of the world and the enduring human desire to experience it deeply. Even though the floating tea houses themselves are gone, their legacy lives on as a reminder of a time when people sought, through art and tea, to harmonize with the world around them. Historians continue to debate the precise nature of the floating tea houses' decline, whether it was the result of political changes, environmental shifts, or the changing tastes of society. But what remains beyond debate is the impact these floating spaces had on Japanese culture. They were a fleeting yet deeply significant part of Edo Japan's history, a testament to the ways in which art, nature, and social life can intersect in profound and beautiful ways. As we near the end of our exploration into the floating tea houses of Edo Japan, it's important to consider the broader implications of their decline and the role they played in shaping Japan's cultural evolution. The floating tea houses represented an idealized vision of life in Edo, a harmonious blend of nature, culture, and the refinement of human interactions. While their physical presence has long disappeared, the lessons we can learn from them still resonate today, particularly when we look at how Japan continues to balance tradition with modernity. One of the key lessons that the floating tea houses impart is the importance of spaces that encourage mindfulness, reflection, and connection. In our fast-paced, technology-driven world, it's easy to forget the value of slowing down and reconnecting with nature, art, and the people around us. The floating tea houses were designed to foster that connection, offering a retreat from the chaotic, bustling world of Edo. These spaces, nestled on the serene waterways of the city, were carefully crafted to encourage guests to pause, take in their surroundings, and focus on the present moment. This was more than just an aesthetic choice. It was a cultural philosophy that has continued to influence Japan's design and architectural principles. Today, Japan continues to emphasize the importance of creating spaces that promote contemplation and tranquility. Modern tea houses and gardens still follow many of the design principles established by the floating tea houses, prioritizing simplicity, natural beauty, and a seamless integration with the environment. This tradition has influenced not only private spaces but also public areas, where parks and gardens are designed to provide moments of peace in the midst of busy urban life. In this sense, the floating tea houses can be seen as the foundation for modern Japanese design principles that continue to prioritize the human connection with nature and the need for moments of quiet reflection. The continued relevance of tea culture in Japan is another testament to the lasting impact of the floating tea houses. Despite their decline, tea ceremonies remain an integral part of Japanese life, celebrated in both private homes and public spaces. Modern tea ceremonies, though often held in fixed tea houses, still embody the same principles that were central to the floating tea houses: mindfulness, respect, and a deep appreciation for the beauty of the moment. The practice of tea remains a way for people to connect with nature, with themselves, and with others. The legacy of the floating tea houses, with their ability to elevate the tea ceremony, continues to shape how tea is experienced in Japan today. The influence of the floating tea houses also extends beyond Japan's borders. Over time, Japan's cultural appreciation for nature and simplicity has influenced global design movements, particularly those focused on creating harmonious, peaceful spaces. The idea of blending architecture with nature, of finding beauty in imperfection, has had a profound effect on how people around the world approach design and urban planning. Today, the influence of wabi-sabi and shake can be seen in everything, from minimalist architecture to urban gardens that seek to create a sense of peace and connection to the natural world. In this way, the floating tea houses, though no longer physically present, have continued to inspire people worldwide, encouraging them to create spaces that promote balance, reflection, and mindfulness. The decline of the floating tea houses also marks the transition from an Edo-era society defined by its strict class structures and feudal hierarchies to a more modern, industrialized Japan. The floating tea houses were born in a time when the merchant class was rising in power, and the old feudal systems were beginning to erode. By the time of their decline, the Meiji Restoration had ushered in an era of rapid modernization, and the social and political systems that had supported the floating tea houses were no longer as relevant. As Japan shifted to a more industrialized society, the traditional spaces that had been at the heart of the floating tea houses were overshadowed by new forms of leisure and entertainment. But even as the tea houses disappeared, their cultural significance remained, acting as a bridge between an older, more contemplative world and the fast-paced, modern one that emerged in the 20th century. While the floating tea houses are no longer a part of Japan's physical landscape, their influence is still visible in how Japanese culture approaches leisure, aesthetics, and the appreciation of nature. The idea that the environment can play an active role in shaping our experiences, helping us to slow down, connect, and reflect, remains an important part of Japan's cultural identity, whether it's through a modern tea ceremony, a stroll through a traditional garden, or the design of minimalist architecture. The spirit of the floating tea houses lives on. Historians continue to reflect on how these tea houses shaped the social dynamics of Edo Japan and contributed to the development of tea culture and Japanese aesthetics. Some suggest that the floating tea houses were a way for the merchant class to assert their status, while others believe they were a genuine reflection of a cultural shift towards greater appreciation of nature, simplicity, and mindfulness. Regardless of the motivations behind their creation, what is clear is that the floating tea houses were a significant cultural phenomenon, one that helped to shape the aesthetics, social practices, and spiritual outlook of Edo Japan. The floating tea houses of Edo Japan may no longer exist in the form they once did, but their legacy endures. From their impact on Japan's tea culture and architectural traditions to their influence on global design and cultural movements, the tea houses continue to inspire those who seek to live in harmony with nature and to appreciate the beauty of the present moment. The floating tea houses may have drifted away with time, but the ideals they represented, the values of mindfulness, simplicity, and connection to the natural world, continue to shape the way we experience the world around us. As we come closer to the end of our exploration, it's important to pause and reflect on the profound impact the floating tea houses had on Japan's relationship with art, culture, and nature, even as the world changed. The tea houses were not only spaces of leisure, but were deeply tied to Japan's artistic and philosophical ideals, from wabi-sabi to the appreciation of impermanence. They represented a harmonious fusion of the natural world and human creation, offering a unique space for cultural exchange, personal reflection, and social interaction. In this section, we'll take a step back and consider how these remarkable spaces influenced art and literature in Edo Japan and continue to shape artistic expressions today. The floating tea houses, with their aesthetic beauty and connection to nature, became common subjects in the visual arts of the Edo period. Ukiyo-e, the famous genre of woodblock prints, frequently depicted the serene beauty of these floating spaces. Artists like Hiroshige and Hokusai used the imagery of floating tea houses to explore the relationship between human structures and the natural world. In these prints, the tea houses float elegantly on calm waters, often surrounded by vibrant natural landscapes, whether it be the cherry blossoms in spring or the fiery reds and oranges of autumn leaves. Through these artworks, the floating tea houses were immortalized not only as luxurious symbols of wealth, but as beautiful, transient spaces that captured the essence of fleeting moments in nature. These prints weren't just about capturing beauty. They also reflected the larger cultural and philosophical undercurrents of the time. The fleeting beauty of the cherry blossoms, the passing of the seasons, and the delicate design of the tea houses themselves all embodied wabi-sabi, the Japanese aesthetic that celebrates imperfection, transience, and the beauty found in simplicity. The floating tea houses, as depicted in these prints, were metaphors for the impermanence of life, a key theme in Zen Buddhism. The act of enjoying tea in such a space was not just about the tea itself, but also about appreciating the moment in all its fleeting beauty. The prints served as a reminder to savor the present, to find beauty in simplicity, and to recognize the ever-changing nature of life. In literature, the floating tea houses also found their place. Edo-era writers, especially those in the ukiyo-zoshi tradition, a genre of popular fiction, often use the imagery of the floating tea house as a setting for scenes of romantic and social intrigue. The tea houses were ideal spaces for these stories, offering a serene yet intimate environment where characters could engage in philosophical musings, share stories, and interact in a more private, refined setting. In many literary works, the floating tea house serves as a metaphor for the delicate balance between societal expectations and personal desires, with the tranquil setting of the tea house allowing characters to step away from the rigidity of Edo society and engage in deeper reflection and self-expression. Even today, the artistic legacy of the floating tea houses is still alive in Japanese culture. Modern Japanese painters, photographers, and filmmakers continue to draw inspiration from the aesthetic principles established by the floating tea houses. The relationship between architecture and nature that the tea houses so beautifully embodied can be seen in contemporary works, from art installations to films. Just as the tea houses of Edo Japan connected people to nature through design, modern works of art and architecture continue to explore this connection, often reflecting on the ephemeral nature of existence and the simple beauty of the world around us. In Japan's architecture, the floating tea houses' legacy also endures. The principles of simplicity, balance, and integration with nature continue to influence modern Japanese homes and public spaces. Architects in Japan have long embraced the idea of creating spaces that allow the natural world to be a constant presence. Modern homes often feature sliding doors that open up to small gardens, bringing the outside in, much like the floating tea houses did centuries ago. The use of natural materials such as wood, stone, and bamboo continues to reflect the deep cultural reverence for the natural world, a reverence that was central to the design of the floating tea houses. Even in urban environments, where space is often limited, architects continue to find ways to bring nature into the built environment, creating peaceful, contemplative spaces that echo the spirit of the floating tea houses. The enduring legacy of the floating tea houses also extends to Japan's tea culture. The practice of tea, particularly the shanoyu, the tea ceremony, continues to be a vital part of Japanese culture. While the floating tea houses are no longer in use, the art of tea making remains a symbol of refinement and mindfulness. Tea ceremonies are still held in many parts of Japan, in both traditional settings and modernized spaces. The tea ceremony, much like the floating tea houses, emphasizes simplicity, mindfulness, and a deep connection with nature. The ceremony is a moment to pause, reflect, and appreciate the present, just as the floating tea houses allowed their visitors to do centuries ago. The legacy of these tea houses lives on in the quiet ritual of preparing and drinking tea, where each movement is deliberate and every sip is a chance to savor the fleeting beauty of the moment. While the floating tea houses may have disappeared from Japan's waterways, the cultural ideals they represented have continued to shape Japan's identity. The balance between nature and architecture, the emphasis on mindfulness and reflection, and the appreciation for impermanence are all values that still resonate today. These ideals have found their way into every corner of Japanese culture, from modern tea ceremonies to urban parks, from contemporary art to everyday life. Historians still ponder the reasons behind the decline of the floating tea houses, but what's clear is that their influence has endured. As Japan has modernized and evolved, the fundamental principles that guided the floating tea houses, the connection between humanity and nature, the importance of mindfulness, and the celebration of impermanence remain deeply embedded in Japanese culture. The floating tea houses may no longer exist, but their spirit continues to inspire people around the world to seek beauty and simplicity, to find peace in nature, and to embrace the present moment. As we near the final sections of our journey through the floating tea houses of Edo, Japan, it's important to reflect on the ways in which these spaces represented the zenith of a particular cultural moment, and how, despite their decline, they still resonate in the modern world. The floating tea houses were not just physical structures on water, they were cultural phenomena that embodied the delicate balance between art, nature, and society. They were deeply intertwined with the values of Edo, Japan, where nature was revered and life's fleeting beauty was celebrated in every aspect of existence. In their heyday, the floating tea houses stood as symbols of luxury and exclusivity, places where the elite could indulge in refined tastes and cultural practices while being immersed in nature. The aesthetic principles that governed the design of the tea houses, the integration of architecture with the natural environment, the embrace of impermanence, and the celebration of simplicity reflected the ideals of Zen Buddhism that permeated Japanese society. Every detail, from the graceful design of the tea house to the thoughtful preparation of tea, was infused with mindfulness and respect for nature. One of the most enduring aspects of the floating tea houses was the way they celebrated the passage of time. The changing seasons, with their constant transformation, were reflected in the experience of visiting the tea houses. The cherry blossoms in spring, the lush greenery of summer, the vivid reds and golds of autumn, and the serene stillness of winter. All these aspects of nature were woven into the experience of tea drinking. The floating tea houses were dynamic spaces that changed with the seasons, offering a constant reminder of the impermanence of life. Just as the flowers bloomed and faded, so too did the moments spent in these tea houses, fleeting, beautiful, and gone before you could fully grasp their fullness. The practice of chanoyu, the tea ceremony, was deeply tied to the ethos of the floating tea houses. It wasn't just about drinking tea, it was about the act of slowing down, of immersing oneself in the present moment, and appreciating the beauty of simplicity. Every gesture, from the preparation of the tea to the way the guests held their bowls, was deliberate and filled with meaning. The floating tea houses provided the perfect setting for this meditative practice, offering a tranquil environment where guests could fully engage with the ceremony, the tea, and the fleeting moment in time. The ceremonial space allowed for reflection and quiet contemplation, echoing the larger philosophy of life in Edo, Japan, where mindfulness and an appreciation for nature were central to everyday existence. Even though the floating tea houses are no longer present in the physical world, the principles they embodied continue to live on in various facets of Japanese culture. Modern tea rooms, inspired by the floating tea houses, continue to embrace the same aesthetic values of simplicity, natural beauty, and mindfulness. The connection between nature and architecture remains central to many contemporary designs, from traditional tea houses to modern homes and public spaces. Japanese gardens, often modelled after the same principles that guided the design of the floating tea houses, continue to serve as places for quiet reflection and connection with nature. Moreover, the influence of the floating tea houses can be seen in the broader global cultural movement that seeks to integrate nature with human-made spaces. Architects and designers around the world are inspired by the concept of blending the indoor and outdoor, creating spaces where nature is not just a backdrop, but an active participant in the human experience. The floating tea houses, with their seamless connection to the natural world, provided a blueprint for this type of design, and their influence continues to be felt in contemporary architecture and urban planning. But the most lasting legacy of the floating tea houses lies in their ability to inspire a mindful approach to living. The tea ceremony, as practiced in these tea houses, was not just an act of drinking tea. It was a practice of slowing down, paying attention to the moment, and finding beauty in simplicity. In today's fast-paced, technology-driven world, the lessons of the floating tea houses feel more relevant than ever. We're constantly bombarded with distractions, and it can be difficult to slow down and truly appreciate the world around us. The floating tea houses, with their emphasis on mindfulness, nature, and impermanence, offer a reminder that there is beauty in simplicity and value, in moments of quiet reflection. Even as Japan's society has transformed over the centuries, the spirit of the floating tea houses has endured. The principles they represented, balance with nature, mindfulness, and the appreciation of life's fleeting beauty, continue to influence Japanese culture and global design. The floating tea houses may be gone, but they have left an indelible mark on the world, shaping the way we think about nature, architecture, and mindfulness. As historians continue to analyze the role of the floating tea houses in Edo, Japan, there remains a sense of nostalgia for these spaces. The elegance and tranquility they embodied were more than just luxuries. They were expressions of cultural ideals that resonated deeply with those who experienced them. The floating tea houses were places where people could slow down, connect with others, and find peace amidst the bustle of life. Their decline may mark the end of a particular era, but the ideals they represented continue to shape the way we approach art, design, and our connection to the natural world. The legacy of the floating tea houses serves as a reminder that the beauty of life is found not in grand gestures or material wealth, but in the quiet moments of reflection, in the connection to nature, and in the simple acts of mindfulness that we engage in every day. In a world that often moves too fast, the spirit of the floating tea houses offers us a chance to pause, appreciate the present moment, and reflect on the fleeting beauty of life. Now, as we approach the final stretch of our exploration into the floating tea houses of Edo, Japan, let's pause to consider the ways these spaces continue to resonate in contemporary culture, not only within Japan but across the globe. The floating tea houses, with their serenity, natural beauty, and refined atmosphere, provide us with timeless lessons on the importance of creating spaces that foster mindfulness, tranquility, and connection with nature. Even in the modern world, the principles they embodied are incredibly relevant, offering valuable insights for how we can navigate the complexities of contemporary life. The influence of the floating tea houses can still be seen in Japan's ongoing reverence for nature. The country's deep connection with the natural world, evident in everything from the design of traditional gardens to the art of tea making, has long been at the heart of Japanese culture. But as Japan has modernized, it has also faced the challenge of maintaining this connection amidst urbanization and technological progress. The floating tea houses, with their seamless integration of nature and human creation, offer a powerful model for how we can live in harmony with our environment, even in the midst of rapid societal change. This model has resonated beyond Japan's borders, inspiring a global movement toward biophilic design, an approach to architecture and urban planning that seeks to integrate natural elements into built environments. The principles of biophilic design are grounded in the same ideals that define the floating tea houses, creating spaces that connect people with nature, promote mindfulness, and foster well-being. The floating tea houses, though long gone, continue to influence how we think about the spaces we inhabit, inspiring architects and designers to create environments that promote a sense of peace and balance in our increasingly chaotic world. Perhaps one of the most profound ways the floating tea houses continue to inspire is in the ongoing practice of tea ceremonies, both in Japan and around the world. The art of the tea ceremony, which once unfolded within the tranquil setting of these floating spaces, remains one of Japan's most cherished cultural traditions. Modern tea ceremonies, whether held in traditional tea houses or contemporary settings, still reflect the core values that the floating tea houses embodied: mindfulness, simplicity, and the appreciation of the fleeting beauty of life. Even as the world has changed, the practice of tea remains an anchor for those seeking a moment of quiet reflection. a chance to slow down and appreciate the present moment. The floating tea houses also remain an enduring symbol of Japanese aesthetics and cultural sophistication. Their design, blending the natural world with the built environment, continues to inspire a broad range of artistic practices. Whether in painting, sculpture, photography or film, the floating tea houses are often referenced as symbols of serenity and elegance. Their beauty, captured in countless works of art from the Edo period to the present, reflects a deep cultural understanding of the connection between humans and nature. Even in the context of modern Japanese art, the floating tea houses have left their mark. Contemporary artists often evoke the imagery of the tea house to explore themes of impermanence, change, and the passage of time, concepts that were so central to the floating tea house's role in Edo society. The tea house, in its fleeting existence on the water, became a metaphor for the transience of life itself. This notion has been embraced by artists around the world, who draw on the symbolism of the floating tea house to explore the ephemeral nature of beauty, art, and human experience. The continuing fascination with the floating tea houses also speaks to a broader cultural shift toward mindfulness and slow living in the modern world. As we face the pressures of fast-paced, consumer-driven lifestyles, many people are seeking ways to reconnect with the simpler, quieter aspects of life. The floating tea houses, with their emphasis on peace, reflection, and connection with nature, provide a model for how we can slow down and engage with the world in a more mindful way. This desire for mindful living is reflected in the growing popularity of mindfulness practices, meditation, and yoga, all of which seek to cultivate a sense of calm and presence in the midst of life's chaos. The floating tea houses, once symbols of exclusive luxury, now serve as metaphors for the kind of mindful, intentional living that many are striving to create today. Furthermore, as urbanization continues to expand across the globe, the need for spaces that promote peace and tranquility becomes even more critical. The floating tea houses, though products of a specific time and place, offer valuable lessons for the design of modern public spaces, places where people can escape the hustle and bustle of city life and reconnect with nature. From parks and green spaces to the increasing popularity of rooftop gardens and urban farms, there is a growing recognition that our physical environments play a critical role in our mental and emotional well-being. The floating tea houses provide a blueprint for creating spaces that balance the human need for connection with nature, offering an antidote to the isolation and disconnection that can arise in our increasingly urbanized world. Historians and cultural scholars continue to explore the legacy of the floating tea houses, and as we reflect on their enduring impact, we can't help but acknowledge the timelessness of their message. The floating tea houses represented an ideal, a vision of life in harmony with nature, art, and mindfulness. Though the physical structures may have disappeared, the spirit of the floating tea houses lives on in the continued practice of tea ceremonies, the design of modern spaces, and the broader cultural appreciation for nature and simplicity. The floating tea houses of Edo Japan were more than just luxurious retreats. They were spaces of reflection, connection, and cultural exchange. They represented a moment in time when art, nature, and society were in delicate balance. As the world continues to change, the lessons of the floating tea houses remain relevant, offering timeless guidance on how we can live more mindfully, appreciate the present, and create spaces that allow us to connect with each other and the world around us. And so, we reach the final chapter of our journey through the floating tea houses of Edo Japan. These spaces, with their serene beauty, tranquil connection to nature, and cultural significance, served as symbols of refinement, mindfulness, and impermanence. Though they eventually faded from the waterways of Edo, their influence has not only endured, but thrived, continuing to shape Japan's cultural and aesthetic practices. Even as modern life progresses, the core ideals embodied by the floating tea houses, simplicity, mindfulness, and harmony with nature, still resonate deeply with those seeking a quieter, more reflective existence in a noisy, fast-paced world. While the floating tea houses were once exclusive sanctuaries for the elite, the values they represented have become accessible to all who seek to create balance in their lives. The concept of mindfulness that was integral to the tea ceremony, once experienced within the floating tea house's peaceful, ever-changing environment, is now a widely adopted practice across cultures. The spirit of the floating tea houses can be felt in the growing global appreciation for slow living. where people pause to reflect, connect with nature, and savor the present moment. In modern Japan, elements of the floating tea house continue to live on in spaces designed to foster mindfulness and connection with nature. The simplicity and elegance of traditional tea rooms and even contemporary gardens still reflect the influence of the tea houses. These spaces remain at the heart of Japan's cultural identity, offering people the opportunity to experience the same sense of peace, reflection, and communion with nature that was once so deeply tied to the floating tea houses. It's also important to recognize the legacy of the floating tea houses in their influence on global design and architecture. The idea of blending natural surroundings with human-made structures has become a guiding principle in creating spaces that promote well-being and foster a deeper connection with the environment. From urban parks to rooftop gardens and biophilic design, the values of the floating tea houses, the integration of nature into daily life, the celebration of impermanence, and the embrace of simplicity have inspired modern architects and designers to create spaces that provide respite from the demands of contemporary living. Furthermore, the art of tea making continues to be a vital cultural practice both in Japan and internationally. The floating tea houses, through their ceremonial spaces and their focus on tea, help to solidify tea culture as a central part of Japanese life. Today, the tea ceremony, with its meditative nature and emphasis on mindfulness, remains an essential practice. Whether in private homes or public spaces, tea ceremonies continue to offer a way to slow down, connect with others, and engage in a deeply personal and reflective ritual that has its roots in the tea houses that once floated on the rivers of Edo. As we reflect on the legacy of the floating tea houses, we're reminded of the importance of spaces that allow us to pause, reconnect, and reflect. In our modern world, where time seems to slip away faster than we can grasp it, the floating tea houses offer a lesson in the value of stillness, nature, and mindfulness. They remind us that beauty exists in the present moment, in the simplicity of nature, and in our ability to engage with the world around us with patience and grace. Historians continue to debate the reasons behind the floating tea houses' decline, and whether they could have survived in some form if Japan's industrialization and modernization had been approached differently. Yet, regardless of their fate, the floating tea houses represent an era when art, nature, and culture converged in a uniquely Japanese way. The floating tea houses of Edo Japan were not just places of luxury, they were cultural sanctuaries where the core values of Japanese society were expressed through architecture, tea, and nature. Today, those values continue to inspire new generations, reminding us that no matter how much the world changes, there is always space for reflection, simplicity, and beauty. In closing, the floating tea houses may have vanished from Japan's rivers, but their legacy is alive in the heart of Japan's culture and beyond. Through their influence on tea culture, garden design, architecture, and even global mindfulness practices, the floating tea houses continue to remind us of the importance of taking time to connect with nature, with each other, and with ourselves. Their graceful design and serene spirit endure, offering us a timeless invitation to slow down, savor the moment, and find peace in the fleeting beauty of life. Now, let's take a final breath and rest in the quiet spaces these tea houses once occupied. Let the calmness of their legacy wash over you, and may it stay with you long after we conclude this journey. 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 We conclude this journey.